Hi everyone, thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really sorry I can't be there with you in person tonight at the LSE. So I was just going to say a few words about the situation of crisis and precarity in the UK higher education sector. I'm Dr. Caroline Edwards. I'm the Executive Director of the Open Library of Humanities, and my work building a sustainable diamond open access publisher directly relates to the situation of crisis and precarity that we find ourselves in at the moment. So analysis by the Office for Students published in May 2024 revealed that 40% of English universities in England face risk of closure, with budget deficits by the end of this year. This report was produced by the government's education regulator and described the, quote, material risk of closure, end quote, unless universities dramatically cut costs or merge over the next few years. Now, this comes on top of the mass redundancies, course closures, departmental and school restructures, and centralisation, or in other words, cutting, of administrative support across the UKRI sector over the past few years. Queen Mary's UCU team have been tracking academic staff redundancies, and that includes both mandatory job cuts as well as the voluntary severance packages on their website on a page titled UKRI is Shrinking. It lists 70 universities out of a total possible of 160 in the UK, and some of these are on their third and fourth rounds of voluntary severance schemes. So news coverage just this week, which you can see a few of the headlines here on my slide, have been coming from UUK, that's Universities UK sources. And they focused on the drastic efficiencies that will need to be made unless the government acts to raise tuition fees, which is politically unpalatable. And we can see here pieces that covered this story in the BBC, The Guardian and The Times, reporting Vice-Chancellor's apparent willingness to merge institutions. Now, of course, the arts and humanities are always the worst hit in these situations. Despite being the cheapest courses to run, with comparatively low contact hours with staff and no additional equipment requirements. As The Guardian reported in March 2023, which followed the announcement of the University of East Anglia cutting 31 arts and humanities academic posts, and I quote, "Promoting science, technology, engineering and maths, or STEM, has been a long-term Tory project on the grounds that these skills are required by the economy," end quote. Now, despite many of the government ministers at the time themselves having humanities degrees, including Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister, the previous Conservative government spent years creating a hostile environment for the arts and humanities. Their explicit aim after 2010 was, quote unquote, the euphemism of market exit for universities that they deemed to be substandard. That is, a deliberate shrinking of the higher education sector and a rolling back, particularly targeted at new post-92 universities. These days, senior management teams aren't allowed to run any deficit departments, and they're pushing scholars to seek more donations and links from local business and industry. As Glenn O'Hara reports, quote, "Outside a few hotspots for arts and culture, that's unlikely to bring in the kind of money that STEM departments can capture. Cash-strapped theatre, dance, music and youth groups are on the edge themselves, without being asked to contribute more," end quote. There's a little slide about the Open Library of Humanities. So we are based at Birkbeck in the University of London, and I have direct personal experience of this crisis in higher education and also in the humanities. My own university threatened 140 redundancies following a large programme of centralising and restructuring professional services staff and several rounds of voluntary severance back in 2022. And this was almost exactly 200 years after Birkbeck had first been founded as an institution to support working Londoners, so that is working class people getting an education. In the event, actually, so many colleagues took voluntary severance and academics were able to relocate elsewhere that our restructuring process was fortunately not nearly as severe and was much more modest. And I don't blame the university for this. This, I should point out, is a systemic problem of targeted, politicised and deliberate underinvestment and underfunding across the UK higher education sector over more than a decade now. It's Birkbeck itself is a unique institution with a special mission, educating working Londoners in the evening so they can continue their work and their caring responsibilities in the daytime. And it's also been a brilliant home for the Open Library of Humanities, which I founded with my friend and colleague, Professor Martin Eve, back in 2013. And we set up the OLH out of necessity. Open access and journals publishing at that time, back in 2012, 2013, was moving rapidly towards an author pay model, where commercial publishers built a new business model to recoup the lost library subscriptions revenue by allowing open access under what were called article processing charges. So this brings me to some definitions, and I was asked to provide a few definitions about open access for a general audience. So here goes. But yeah, Diamond Open Access is the name that has been given to not-for-profit open access publishing, where the readers don't pay to access the content and the authors don't have to pay to publish the content. But of course, that doesn't mean that we don't have publishing costs as professional academic publishers. Next, please, Joe. So following what Monica was, let's go with this one then. So the general idea when we set up the Open Library of Humanities, and we did it in consultation with librarians from Europe, North America, was that a large number of library partners would all contribute small, affordable sums when they're working with stretched budgets. And that when we pool all of these small funds together, that would give us sufficient reserves to pay for the costs of publishing. And then we would be publishing articles that authors didn't need to pay article processing charges for. That's what we did. And they're very affordable sums. I mean, a standard average library membership is to cover all of the costs of publishing 33 journals is cheaper than a single article processing charge. So it's usually around the £2,000 or just over $2,000 mark. Next slide, please, Joe. So we have 33 journals, and pretty quickly into launching the OLH back in 2015, we were so overwhelmed with people wanting to set up new journals, whilst there were also a number of journals that needed to transition away from subscription publishing models, that we actually stopped accepting new applications and we focused exclusively on what we call flipping. This is a term that's become used in the industry, and it simply means that we persuade an academic journal that is publishing through a paywall or a subscription model. We persuade them to leave their commercial publisher, to move to the Open Library of Humanities, and to relaunch as a Diamond Open Access publisher. And if that sounds straightforward as a process, let me tell you that it's absolutely not straightforward. In some cases, journals are lucky enough that the scholarly societies who founded them, and sometimes these date back a century or 50, 60 years, they had the foresight to protect their journal IP and set up some sort of legal entity. And so their decision to move away from a publisher like Wiley or Elsevier, Taylor and Francis, Informa Group, Springer Nature, these kinds of commercial entities. So their decision to with this Labour review.
You had to kind of, that was the last, this was the...
Technical coding work with our software engineering team to try and make all of that back content openly available. Can you guys still hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect, thank
Yes.
you. In other cases, and Monica, sorry, I've not finished yet. Back, Joe. In other cases, as Monica was just mentioning, the journals were founded with the commercial publishers during a period of great expansion, kind of post-war American boom of university funding. Commercials, moved in on this outsourcing because there was huge profits to be made. So many times the editorial networks, boards, the scholarly societies don't actually own the IP of their journal. And so Theory and Society was one such example. So when that happens, what we have to do is we have to set up a rival title with a very similar name, preferably. We have to carefully coordinate marketing and comms so that the entire scholarly community understands what the story is, what has happened, why the editors have chosen to start a new journal with the OLH as the continuation and the kind of true legacy of the former title. And then we leave the former title, often with an academic boycott. So the whole community has to agree that they will not submit their articles to that title and they will not do any peer review work for that title. A very good example of this is political philosophy, which you can see down here. We flipped political philosophy in January of this year. Sometimes these negotiations have to move really fast and we can't advertise them in advance. In most cases, the editors in have signed non-compete clauses with publishers like Wiley. So I'm not allowed to talk to them directly, or they might be in legal trouble. They need to take legal advice because they are employees of large universities, which are then liable to some sort of legal action. There's a lot of kind of cloak and dagger that has to take place to make this happen. And with political philosophy, their former title was the Journal of Political Philosophy, which is one of the top 3 philosophy journals worldwide. And that was a classic example. And I lost count of the number of times I speak week in, week out with editors to whom this has happened. The commercial publishers are pushing the editors to double, triple, quadruple the number of articles that they will accept and publish because the business models have changed. Whereas with subscription, selling library subscriptions, now they're relying on article processing charges or transformative agreements, and they basically receive payments the more articles the journal can publish. So the publishers are imposing this on editors, and if the editors kick back, what can happen is they find themselves fired, and they can fire the editor-in-chief, and the publisher can impose a whole new editorial team to take over the title, which we call a zombie title because it's sort of the living dead journal that stumbles on. And even more shocking than this is the fact that in many cases within these commercial publishing platform systems that have all their kind of workflows interconnected with the entire publisher, where an article is rejected and maybe doesn't enter peer review, maybe it's a desk reject, maybe it is rejected through the review process. If the editors aren't careful and they don't untick a very small default setting, that article is basically immediately taken and distributed through the whole system. So they may have rejected it, but it will be published somewhere sooner or later amongst any number of the other titles that the commercial publisher hosts, which I find truly shocking as a scholar. Research integrity is everything to us. I didn't know it was called cascading. That's super interesting. Thanks, Dave. But if research integrity is what our entire profession is founded on in an era of misinformation, then we are being actively undermined by our publishers, the commercial publishers, in trying to do our work. Okay, maybe next slide, please. So these are just a few stats that I put together recently for our annual report. Our OLH authors have come from 46 countries. Articles have been viewed and downloaded 5.3 million times. Our library members come from 21 countries. We have published more than 13,500 articles since 2015, but that does include liberating and flipping back content that dates back to the 1960s for some journals. And the best closest figure I could come up with, and get in touch with me if you think you've got any data that will help me make this more accurate. But I estimate that we have saved libraries £33.9 million in article processing charges since 2015, and that's based on an average article processing charge of £2,500, which is pretty much average. So it's an astonishing amount, and this is only just the beginning. Next slide, please, Joe. So Diamond Open Access is working. I think there are a lot of reasons to be kind of excited about the future. And we need it now more than ever. You know, we've heard about how horrendous the higher education crisis is. It's particularly acute in the UK, but it is hard in other countries too. And one of the ways that we manage to make our project sustainable, so the Open Library of Humanities has been around a little bit longer than the COPIM funded project and the Open Book Collective project, not the individual partners maybe, but the project as a whole. And one of the ways that we managed to become sustainable after we received early grant funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation was that my colleague Martin Eve, who is hopefully with us somewhere tonight in the audience, and my colleague Andy Byers actually built our own open source infrastructure. We built an end-to-end publishing platform with all of the workflows that you would expect, called Janeway, which, yes, that is a Star Trek reference. And what differentiates Janeway from other platforms, I think, honestly, is the fact that Andy and Martin had the foresight to protect it with a copyleft license, the GNU Affero General Public License. And the reason why I emphasize this, and this is so important, is that there are very few open infrastructures available to us. And those of us who work in open access publishing have seen time and time again a really compelling project that seems to be doing well will sell out or get bought up to a large commercial publisher if it is not legally protected. Many journals around the world use open journals systems, which is made available for free by the Public Knowledge Project that was started by John Walensky over at Simon Fraser University, and it's had a fantastically influential role in the open access movement. But that platform, for example, is not protected under a copyleft license, and so it can be commercialized. Commercial entities can basically kind of take that code base, whack a nice kind of pretty front cover on it and start charging somebody for it. And we know that libraries and research councils and national funders are not happy about this situation. In fact, they've started to insist that the infrastructures that open are so it's a really important point. Next slide, please. I think this might be coming up to the last one. If you can hear me, Joe.
Yep.
To the next one, and then I'll finish up. Thank you.
One more.
Yeah, there should be one more. Or I put animation sequences in. You're going to have to click through to get all the bullet points. Thank you. Okay, so Diamond Open Access is working. I'm borrowing here from the COPIM project, and specifically from Yannicka Adema, who wrote a great article about this called Scaling Small. And if you'll bear with me, I'm just going to attempt to read a quotation from it because it's great. She said that scaling small means an alternative organizational principle for governing community-led publishing projects based on mutual reliance, care, and other forms of commoning. This principle eschews standard approaches to organizational growth that tend to flatten community diversity through economies of scale. Instead, Scaling Small puts forward the idea that scale can be nurtured through intentional collaborations between community-driven projects that promote a bibliodiverse ecosystem while providing resilience through resource sharing and other kinds of collaboration. So that's one way we can do this. And the COPIM project and Open Book Collective, is a fantastic example of that. But as Joe was mentioning, it is not yet sustainable, so it needs your help. Another way that I've been working on is journal ownership. So kind of liberating these journals by flipping them away from their commercial publishers
and then ensuring that we set up a new title that has its own IP and that has legal entity behind it to protect that IP from potential future commercial acquisition. We can also flip back content open, so we can open up journal archives that date back decades, and we can make sure that the editors republish those articles under a Creative Commons license, which in the 1960s obviously didn't exist. And so we can flip large volumes of articles in that way. And then finally, academic librarian advocacy. So working together, academics, particularly in the open access publishing space, can work with library purchasing teams, and we can push back against transformative agreements. And I feel hopeful about this too. There is a lot of work to be done here, but we know that libraries are public institutions and they have a responsibility to the taxpayer money that goes into them, as do national funders and research councils. They do not want to be spending that money in commercial infrastructures and commercial academic published content, published by a commercial publisher, sorry. What they actually need, and this is where I'm really interested in working together, is they need data. They actually need a growing evidence base of the value of Diamond Open Access publishing, of the estimated value that we might be saving them in revenue they would have otherwise had to spend in subscription fees and so on. And my final point is, if there's any UK librarians attending this, we're very aware how tight budgets are. We know that budgets are being cut in many places. I think the key message that we should focus on is that we are not asking for a handout, and we are not asking for the open access budget to be larger. We know that may not be possible. What we are asking is for your help to redistribute the funds that you have to allocate to those large commercial negotiations. And if we can help you by giving you evidence that those journals are no longer valuable because they're zombies, because they've lost the academic support and integrity of the research communities that founded them, then you should be able to confidently go into those negotiations and downwardly revise the payments that you're willing to make, or walk away from the deals altogether. So this is about redistribution. And I think that's perhaps the exciting next chapter for Diamond Open Access Publishing. Thank you so much for bearing with me with the crazy Lisbon Business Lounge Wi-Fi.